The voice coach leaned back in his chair and said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You've got range, Michael. Real range. But there's a problem." He tapped his pen against the desk. "You sound too white. If you want to make it in soul music, you need to sound more black." Michael Jackson stood up. He didn't say anything right away. He was 21 years old, standing in a rented rehearsal space in Los Angeles, and the man across from him had 15 years of experience coaching R&B singers. The kind of experience that was supposed to matter, the kind that was supposed to mean something. Wait, because what Michael did next didn't just walk away from bad advice. It redrew the line between what the industry thought music had to be and what it actually could become. The year was 1979. Michael had just finished the most successful stretch of his young life. Off the Wall was climbing charts. Critics were calling him a prodigy. Quincy Jones was calling him a genius. But Michael wasn't satisfied. He never was. He heard something in his head that wasn't on the record yet, a sound that didn't fit into the boxes people kept trying to build around him. So he hired a vocal coach. Not Quincy's recommendation, not his label's suggestion. Someone independent, someone who worked with gospel singers and jazz vocalists and claimed he could unlock the full potential of any voice. The first session was a Tuesday afternoon. The rehearsal space smelled like old carpet and coffee. The coach had Michael run through scales for 20 minutes, just listening. No corrections, no feedback, just observation. At the end, he nodded and said Michael had one of the cleanest voices he'd ever heard. Natural pitch control, excellent range, a foundation most singers would kill for. The second session focused on breathing. The coach taught Michael how to support notes from his diaphragm instead of his throat, how to control his air so he could hold a phrase longer without strain. Michael absorbed it all. He practiced every technique exactly as instructed. By the third session, the coach said he'd never worked with anyone who learned faster. Then came the fourth session. The coach had been listening to "Don't Stop Till You Get Enough" on repeat that morning. He told Michael he loved the song, loved the energy, loved the falsetto. But then he said, the part that's stuck, the market's tricky right now. Radio stations are split. Black stations play black artists. White stations play white artists. Your voice sits in the middle, and that's dangerous. You need to pick a side. Michael asked which side. The coach didn't hesitate. You're a black artist. Lean into it. Give them what they expect. More grit, more growl, more of that raw soul sound. Right now, you sound like you're trying to appeal to everyone, and that's how you appeal to no one. Michael walked to the window. The rehearsal space overlooked a parking lot, nothing scenic, but he stared at it like it held answers. He asked the coach if he thought Stevie Wonder sounded too white. The coach said that was different. Stevie had already broken through. Michael was still proving himself. So you're saying I need to change my voice to fit a category? The coach nodded. I'm saying you need to understand the business. Soul music has a sound. Motown has a sound. If you want airplay, if you want credibility in the black community, you need to sound like you belong there. Michael turned around. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. My voice doesn't belong to a community. It belongs to music. The coach blinked. He started to respond, but Michael kept talking. You're telling me to sound more black. What does that even mean? Does it mean I sing like James Brown? Like Marvin Gaye? Like Sam Cooke? Because all three of them sound completely different. Or does it mean I make my voice rougher so white listeners know I'm black, and black listeners know I'm black enough? The coach shifted in his seat. I'm trying to help you succeed. By telling me my voice is wrong. By telling you the industry has rules. Michael shook his head. Then the industry's wrong. Notice something. This wasn't a kid throwing a tantrum. This was a decision. Michael had spent his entire childhood being told what to sing, how to sing, when to sing. He'd been told to smile more, dance harder, hit the note exactly the way his father wanted, and he did it. He did all of it. But somewhere between I Want You Back and Rock With You, he'd realized something the people around him hadn't figured out yet. Music didn't have a color. It had a feeling, and the feeling didn't care what box you tried to put it in. The coach tried a different approach. Look, I get it. You're an artist. You want to be free. But freedom doesn't pay the bills. You think Quincy Jones got where he is by ignoring the market? You think Berry Gordy built Motown by letting artists do whatever they wanted? Michael's jaw tightened. Quincy told me to find my own voice, not someone else's version of what my voice should be. And Quincy's brilliant, but he's also practical. He knows how to make a hit. He knows what works. What works, Michael said slowly, is being honest. If I change my voice to sound more black, then I'm lying. If I change it to sound more white, I'm lying. The only version that's true is the one that comes out when I stop thinking about what anyone else wants. The session ended 20 minutes later. The coach said he'd think about a new approach. Michael said he'd think about whether he needed a coach at all. They shook hands. It was professional. It was polite. It was over. Michael didn't go back. He spent the next 3 months working alone. No coach. No outside voice telling him what soul was supposed to sound like. He locked himself in his home studio and experimented. He tried singing the same line 10 different ways. He recorded himself speaking, then singing, then speaking again, listening for the moments where his natural voice broke through the performance. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night. In late October, Michael was running through a melody he'd been toying with for weeks. Nothing fancy, just a simple phrase repeated over and over. He'd sung it smooth, he'd sung it rough, he'd sung it with vibrato and without. None of it felt right. Then he stopped trying to make it sound like anything and just let it come out the way it wanted to. The result was quieter than he expected. More controlled, less about power, and more about precision. He played it back 3 times. That was it. That was the voice he'd been looking for. From that point on, everything changed. He stopped worrying about whether he sounded black or white or anything in between. He focused on whether it sounded true. When he hit a note, he asked himself if he meant it. When he added a breath or a pause, he asked himself if it served the song or just filled space. The answers weren't always obvious, but the process was: strip away everything that wasn't honest, and whatever's left is your voice. Remember this: the version of Michael Jackson the world knows, the one with the sharp inhales and the breathy tones and the way he could flip from a growl to a whisper in the same phrase, didn't come from a vocal coach or a studio executive or a market analysis. It came from a 21-year-old who decided the only voice worth perfecting was his own. By 1982, he was working on Thriller. Quincy was producing. The sessions were intense. Michael had ideas for a song called Billie Jean. The bass line was hypnotic. The rhythm was tight, but the vocal was the part that mattered. Michael sang it the way he heard it. No grit for the sake of grit. No growl for the sake of authenticity. Just his voice, clean and precise and unmistakably his. The first take happened late at night. The studio was almost empty. Just Michael, Quincy, and the engineer. Michael stepped up to the microphone and closed his eyes. When he opened his mouth, the sound that came out wasn't trying to be anything except honest. The breathy precision, the controlled tension, the way he bent certain syllables just enough to make them memorable without making them showy. Quincy stopped the playback halfway through and looked at the engineer. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. This was the sound they'd been chasing for 3 years. Michael did 7 more takes anyway. Not because the first one wasn't perfect, because perfection to Michael meant knowing he'd tried every possible version and chosen the right one on purpose, not by accident. By take 8, even he couldn't find anything to improve. Quincy called it. The vocal was locked. 2 weeks later, the label executives heard the full mix. They were ecstatic. Billie Jean was going to be massive. Radio would eat it up. The clubs would play it non-stop. There was just one more platform they needed. The one that was quickly becoming the most powerful force in music, MTV. Quincy loved it. The label loved it. But there was a problem no one had solved yet. In 1982, MTV was the biggest thing in music, and it had an unspoken rule. The channel played rock. It played pop. It played new wave. It did not play black artists. There were exceptions, but they were rare, and they were calculated. The executives at MTV would tell you it wasn't about race. They'd say it was about format. They'd explain that their audience wanted a specific sound, and R&B didn't fit. But everyone in the industry knew what that meant. MTV had built a wall, and it wasn't interested in tearing it down. Michael's label wanted Billie Jean to be the song that broke through. They sent the video to MTV in early 1983. The response came back fast. It didn't fit their format. The audience wouldn't connect. Rock and black music didn't mix. The label pushed back. They explained, this wasn't just another R&B single. This was Michael Jackson. This was the biggest pop song of the year. MTV still said no. They offered to play it late at night, in the graveyard slots where ratings didn't matter. The label said that wasn't good enough. Here's what most people don't know. The standoff lasted 3 weeks. CBS Records had leverage. They owned the rights to dozens of artists MTV depended on. Rock acts, pop acts, new wave bands. If CBS pulled their catalog, MTV's entire programming structure would collapse. But using that leverage meant risking the relationship between the two biggest players in the industry. Nobody wanted to make that call. Then Walter Yetnikoff made it anyway. Yetnikoff was the head of CBS Records, and he didn't believe in polite negotiations when the answer should have been obvious from the start. He called MTV's parent company and laid it out in terms they couldn't misinterpret. If Billie Jean didn't go into rotation, every CBS video would disappear from MTV. All of them. Immediately. The rock acts that propped up their daytime programming. The pop acts that kept their ratings competitive. Everything. MTV reconsidered. Billie Jean went into rotation. The video premiered in March 1983. It was the first time many white teenagers had ever seen Michael Jackson perform. They didn't hear a black voice or a white voice. They heard a voice that moved, a voice that didn't ask for permission to exist in a space it wasn't supposed to occupy. Within weeks, Billie Jean was everywhere. MTV's ratings spiked. Other black artists started getting airplay. The wall didn't come down overnight, but it cracked, and Michael was the one holding the hammer. The impact wasn't just statistical, it was cultural. Before Billie Jean, MTV executives could claim their format was about sound, not race, and most people couldn't prove otherwise. After Billie Jean, that excuse died. Because if Michael Jackson fit the format, then the format was bigger than they'd been pretending. Prince got airplay 6 months later. Tina Turner followed. Lionel Richie, Whitney Houston. The floodgates didn't open wide, but they opened, and every artist who walked through owed something to the fact that Michael refused to change his voice to make executives comfortable. Here's the part that matters. MTV didn't give Michael airplay because they suddenly developed a conscience. They gave it to him because refusing to play Billie Jean would have made them look irrelevant. The song was too big. The demand was too loud. Keeping it off the channel would have been the same as admitting they didn't understand their own audience. And that's the brilliance of what Michael did. He didn't ask for permission. He made permission irrelevant. Listen, the coach who told Michael to sound more black wasn't a villain. He was giving advice based on the system he knew. The system that said black artists had to sound a certain way to be taken seriously by black audiences, and they had to sound a different way to be palatable to white audiences, and the two could never overlap. The coach believed in that system because the system had been working for decades. But Michael didn't. He rejected the premise. Not because he thought race didn't matter. Not because he was trying to erase his blackness, but because he understood something the industry didn't. Music could cross boundaries if you stopped building them in the first place. Years later, MTV would interview Michael about breaking their color barrier. The interviewer asked if he felt like he'd done something revolutionary. Michael said he just made the music he wanted to make. The revolution happened because people were ready to listen. That's the part no one talks about. Michael didn't force MTV to change. He made them irrelevant to the conversation. Billie Jean was so undeniable, so universally compelling, that refusing to play it meant admitting you were out of touch, and MTV couldn't afford that. The voice coach never worked with Michael again. Word got around that they'd had a disagreement about artistic direction. Some people assumed Michael was being difficult. Some assumed the coach didn't understand his vision. The truth was simpler. Michael didn't need someone to teach him how his voice should sound. He needed space to discover what it already was. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. By the time Thriller became the best-selling album of all time, the question wasn't whether Michael's voice was black enough or white enough. The question was whether anyone else could do what he did. The answer was no, not because his voice was technically perfect, not because he had more range than anyone else, but because he refused to let anyone else define what it was supposed to be. The coach had said, music has rules. Michael proved music has possibilities, and the difference between those two things is the difference between a career that fits the system and a career that rewrites it. Michael Jackson didn't break MTV's color barrier by sounding more black. He broke it by sounding more Michael, and that turned out to be the only sound that mattered.